Let's take a look back at some of the stupidity that people have said, because sometimes you need to see what they have said to determine if you should listen to them at all. So, let's take a look at this clip and wonder what Anna's actually getting at.
As tensions continue to escalate between Russia and Ukraine, the United States and NATO have sprung into action, and I would argue not in such a great way, indicating that conflict with Russia might be imminent. Now let's start off with NATO forces and what they're doing, and then we'll get to the United States. NATO said Monday, meaning today, that it would send additional ships and fighter jets to Eastern Europe as Britain ordered some diplomats and their families to leave Ukraine amid growing alarm that Russia may invade as it masses tens of thousands of troops near its border. Okay, so I just want you guys to ask yourselves why they are doing that, because the narrative in the United States is that they're doing it as a way to prepare for an invasion into Ukraine. But I would also ask you to look into the provocations by NATO for quite some time now that might have also persuaded them to protect its borders. I'm not a huge fan of Vladimir Putin. I think that's pretty clear. But I think that we're getting one side of the story here. And one thing that's really important to also look at is the comments coming from Ukraine. Remember, Ukraine is the alleged victim here, right? Ukraine is apparently dealing with a serious threat here. But the comments in some of these stories, which of course are buried in like paragraph 28, tell you something a little different. And I just ask to be detailed in your analysis here. So let me give you more. Members, meaning NATO members, are putting forces on standby and sending additional ships and fighter jets to NATO deployments in Eastern Europe, reinforcing allied deterrence and defense as Russia continues its military buildup in and around Ukraine. All right. So what about the United States? Well, the latest news as we speak about this is that as many as 8,500 US troops have been put on heightened notice for possible deployment to Eastern Europe. Also, US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has issued a warning to essentially prepare for deployment at the direction of President Joe Biden. And this is the latest step that the US has taken to prepare for potential war, a potential Russian invasion. The US is also considering cutting off Russia from, this is considered the nuclear option, no pun intended, cutting off Russia from the global financial system. Essentially, the Treasury Department would do that. And if they do that, it's very similar to what happened to Iran. It would be catastrophic for Russia's economy, more importantly, for the people of Russia. Let me give you more. Germany is also considering ending its partnership with Russia by cutting off the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, gas pipeline. So there's a lot at stake for Russia. Again, it could be cut off from the global economy. It could be cut off from this lucrative pipeline deal with Germany. And the way that this is being reported on would have you believe that Russia invading Ukraine is imminent. Like they're preparing, they're gonna do it any day now. But Ukraine has a different take. Now, the United States on Sunday ordered families of diplomats to leave Kiev and ordered non-essential diplomatic staff to also leave. The State Department also cautioned American citizens to consider leaving Ukraine, with US officials warning that an attack could happen at any time. But what's really going on? Well, Ukrainian officials, including the leader of Ukraine, is telling the people of Ukraine, like, this seems pretty scary, but calm down because the threat is not as serious as the United States would have you believe. In fact, one official from Ukraine says, while we respect the right of foreign states to ensure the security of their diplomatic missions, we consider such steps by the American side to be premature and sign of excess caution. Ukraine Foreign Ministry spokesperson Oleg Nikolenko said in a statement. In fact, there have been no cardinal changes in the security situation recently, he added, noting that the concentration of Russian forces on Ukraine's borders began last April. So he's like, I mean, yeah, I guess the US can do what it wants to do, but like we don't really see a change in our security. Like why are things escalating all of a sudden? Let me give you more. Now, my take is that the United States has been intentionally crossing what's been referred to as Russia's red line, Putin's red line, and it really has to do with NATO. The heart of this conflict, I mean, the media in the United States would have you believe that it's all about Russia wanting to invade Ukraine. But Russia has been increasingly frustrated with the United States and with NATO. And its red line is the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO. They don't want that. They see that as a provocation. That gets left out of the conversation. And if you look at the history of the United States and its relationship to Russia, this has been a point of conflict for a long time. In fact, the United States has reneged on its promises to avoid expanding NATO.
Russia threatening war because NATO is threatening them? Is Russia threatening war against NATO? No. Russia is threatening war against another country because they say NATO is a threat to them. But Anna, is it ever okay to threaten war to get what you want? Is that what you think? Is that your policy? It's okay to threaten war because you feel threatened? That excuse, caution, was warranted? Okay, let's take a look at that. What promises did America break? None. There is no treaty saying that NATO would not expand westward. There's also no written down agreement saying that Russia has a right to veto any country entering into NATO. There is none. Boris Yeltsin wrote in 1993 a letter to US President Bill Clinton at that time. Any possible integration of East European countries into NATO will not automatically lead to the alliance somehow turning against Russia. The Russian claim that NATO said it would not expand eastward is not based on any reality or historic fact. Anna has just taken Russia's word without looking it up. Now, there are plenty of people that say it, but when you drill down into where it comes from, it was never agreed to. There's no treaty. Now, there are people that said some of the people that were working on the treaty mentioned that, but it wasn't put into the final. When you're negotiating, you offer things, and if they don't want it or care about it, which they didn't because they didn't demand it was put into the treaty, it's not a promise. It's not something you give people. When you're negotiating, you don't give them everything that you said that you might give them if they agree to this. You would give them what they agreed to. So NATO is not bound to not expand. NATO is not bound to not expand to every single country encircling Russia. That does not put a threat to Russia because NATO is a defense. NATO can't attack people as a group because of the NATO treaty. They can attack people as a group because they grouply decided. But the reality is, the claims that Russia had a promise that NATO wouldn't expand eastward has only been brought up recently. As in, Putin is the issue because Putin likes to say that because he has an excuse to do whatever the hell he wants. Yes, that is what it is. Anna fell for Russia propaganda and didn't bother to check her facts. Now, there was never any threat that NATO posed to Russia. We never agreed not to expand eastward, no matter what Anna says. There is no evidence. So, let's continue on.
NATO is a relic of the Soviet era, right? It was a response to the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And there was this promise by both the George H.W. Bush administration and the Bill Clinton administration to stop expanding NATO after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union collapsed, and guess what? They continued expanding. And that has been a provocative move by NATO and the United States, of course. And for a long time, Russia's kind of given a side eye to that. But the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO is seen as more provocative because NATO shares a border with, Ukraine shares a border with Russia. So that's one of the reasons why Russia sees it as incredibly provocative. Since they see it as provocative, they've been gathering their troops and their military capability at the border. They see it as defensive, whereas the United States and NATO sees it as offensive. Let me give you more. Branko Marcetic, in my opinion, has written the best comprehensive pieces on this conflict. It's very real, it gives you the historical context necessary to understand the conflict, and it's certainly more fair than anything you're gonna read in the Washington Post or the New York Times. In a piece that he wrote in Jacobin back in December of last year, he said, when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union dissolved, there was ostensibly no more use for NATO. And both the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations told Russian leadership that the alliance wouldn't expand eastward. But guess what? It continued to expand. In fact, privately, Bush's Pentagon urged Washington to leave the door ajar for Eastern European membership down the line, which is exactly what they did, under criticism from no less than Robert Gates, defense secretary for both Bush's son and Barack Obama, and George Kennan, the father of US anti-communist policy of containment. So they got criticism from people who have not been pro-Russia. Like, yo, you promised not to expand, eastward with the NATO alliances, you continue to do it, and this is gonna be counterproductive. Sure enough, it ended up being pretty counterproductive. Between 1999 and 2020, 14 countries joined the alliance, all of them from Eastern Europe, and 2 of them scraping right up against the Russian border. Kennan had worried this would inflame the nationalistic, anti-Western, and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion and impel Russian foreign policy in a direction decidedly not to our liking, as Marcetic writes, which, looking back in hindsight, is pretty spot on. Now, while Russia hated the expansion of NATO, the inclusion, again, of Ukraine has been a red line because of the fact that they share a border, okay? That gets left out of the conversation. Just take a look at this map. This is from the Washington Post that shows you the border that they share. Yes, Russia did annex Crimea in 2014, and I would venture to say that the situation now is a little different, okay? There were certainly separatists in Crimea who wanted to be part of Russia rather than Ukraine. People disagree with what Russia did. I think that there's valid, that's a valid thought. But right now, we need to also consider what Russia stands to lose if it invaded Ukraine. It stands to lose a lot. Its economy is in shambles already. You have the United States already, implementing all sorts of sanctions against Russia. They want to take it a step further with the possible nuclear option of cutting Russia off from the global economy, which would mean that it would be in the same state that Iran is in, which is a complete and utter disaster. Again, the people of Iran are really suffering. They're bearing the brunt of US aggression toward the country, and the same will be true of Russia if Russia does really show any real evidence of wanting to invade Ukraine.
It's America's fault because Russia said so? Really. Don't listen to anything the United States has because she is jaded as can be. But, a dictator ruling over his people and murdering all of his opponents? Yes, believe that, but not, the US government, because, the US government has lied before, so dictator first. They wonder why politicians don't come on their show. I wonder why. America gets kicked in the teeth, Democrats get kicked in the teeth, and then TYT bitches and moans that why won't the Democrat establishment come and see us, because we just hate on them 24 hours a day. We occasionally give them a little bit of credit for all that they do, but not much. The sanctions on Russia, they were in response to attacking Crimea, attacking American soldiers with mercenaries. That's questionable. There are some people that say that didn't happen, like Russia. And Anna Muskie, both sides. Well, not equal time, because she bought Russia's propaganda about, they had a promise. We promised them. Oh. See, aggression can't be met with appeasement, because when you do that, dictators, authoritarians just push forward. Appeasement to them says that they're allowed to do it. So yes, America should supply Ukraine with the weapons to defend themselves. Not just the weapons we already gave them, but about 10 times as much. We are worried that Russia will drop a nuclear weapon. That is true. But if Russia wasn't a nuclear force, Russia would have already been pushed back into their own country and the war would have been over, because the United States would have provided Ukraine with the necessary weapons to have done that already. Putin is getting the soft treatment because of his psychological issues. He believes that there's a massive conspiracy around the world that's out to get him. And so we have to go in soft. Now the question is NATO to blame for Russia's seizing of Crimea? How about their war in Georgia? Was those also NATO's fault?
Again, you can argue, and I would say that this is actually the case, that Russia is responding to NATO aggression by getting its troops ready at the border because they're concerned about Ukraine getting military weaponry from the United States, joining NATO, which they see as a provocation. Everything the US has done, everything that NATO has done, has not really helped. It's only escalated the situation. Rather than approach this in possible diplomatic ways, everything the US has done has actually been pretty aggressive. Some might argue that sanctions aren't a form of war, but it is. It is a form of war, especially sanctions that harm the Russian people. So we're also, by the way, this is important, meddling in Russian elections, which is an important point that gets left out of all the reporting you see on this situation. And it should be an important point to bring up, considering we spent so much time reporting on and showing concern for Russian meddling in the US election. In May of 2021, US officials were tricked into admitting on camera that they have a very, very active program throughout Russia and were targeting the country's legislative elections, meaning this political meddling is still going on. So the way, again, that this is being reported makes it seem like Russia bad, US and NATO good. But that's not the case. It's way more nuanced than that. And the aggression by the United States and NATO is worth noting because that's how you understand some of the decisions that are being made by the Kremlin.
Nuance is completely lost on this one. How does Ukraine have anything to do with this when they weren't going to join NATO? There was no plans for them to join NATO. NATO wasn't saying it. Ukraine might have wanted it, but probably lots of people want things that they're never going to have. Russia wanted to take over Ukraine. That's it. Russia lost its puppet in Ukraine, and now they want Ukraine back. That's it. There's no nuance here. There's no, if NATO didn't expand, it wouldn't have provoked Russia to attack a completely unrelated country. No. Putin lost its little dictatorship that they had, and now they want it back. It's quite cut and dry when you actually look at the facts, even back then.
We should also be concerned about war with two nuclear countries here, right? Washington and Moscow alone own around 90% of the world's nuclear warheads, or a little more than 8,000 stockpiled between them, with around 2,000 of them on high operational alert. This is more than enough to annihilate each other and human civilization as a whole. Kind of relevant to the discussion, no? Because everywhere you go right now in corporate media, the war drums are being like they're hitting the war drums. Like they can't wait for a possible US invasion of Russia, which would be absolutely insane. Rather than saying, hey, why don't we take a step back and really assess what's at stake here? We're putting 8,500 US troops on alert for possible deployment to Eastern Europe. How is that a smart idea? It's really incredible stuff. And just to give you one example of one of the doofuses in corporate media that's beating the war drums, we've got Joe Scarborough, who tweeted, "The Russians see our retreat from Afghanistan as a green light to invade Ukraine. China sees American passivity toward Ukraine as a green light to invade Taiwan. Regardless of the US's ultimate position, this is the reality the White House faces."
I'll give her this. Joe Scarborough shouldn't be taken seriously about anything. He's a former Republican member of the House. Complete idiot. Didn't see Republicans' blatant racism when he was in the party. Supported Donald Trump when he was running for office, telling how Donald Trump is running circles around the media. Yeah, actually all he was doing is blatantly lying, and the media just jumping from one of his scandals to the next one without pointing out that he was completely unqualified in everything that they said about him, because he was. Republicans get to run around the media because the media has been conditioned that any criticism of Republicans is being too harsh on them. Now, when the media says they need to give equal treatment, what they really mean is they need to give both platforms an equal footing. But when one party is completely delusional, full of conspiracy theories, that equal footing is a couple flights of stairs, an elevator, and them handicapping Democrats by bashing them in the kneecaps over and over again. So Anna's right about that one point. The options. See, she doesn't think about the options. Nuance. What were the options? We told Russia that NATO was not going to expand to Ukraine because NATO couldn't expand to Ukraine because Ukraine had a dispute on their border already. So they couldn't expand to Ukraine until the Crimea was settled. So, nuance? We could have begged Russia not to attack, which we did. We could do absolutely nothing whatsoever, and Russia would have attacked. We could have apologized for putting sanctions on them when they did a chemical attack in another country to murder people they didn't like. What exactly is Anna wanting here? America to do absolutely nothing and be blamed when something goes wrong. Sometimes America isn't the bad guy. Hard to see it because Anna wraps up in all the crap that Republicans have done and wraps it into a nice, neat little package so she can understand it. And then she deals with history as that. So, all the crap America's done overseas, she doesn't notice that it's 90% under Republicans. But she just sees it as wrong. It's sad. Alright, now if you like those videos, help me make more. Like, subscribe down below. Or you can go to my Patreon page and help support us. Or if you really want to help stop global warming, down below there's a power pipe that could end global warming in the next decade.